Hey, welcome back. So we're looking at this response to Jean Hyppolite's commentary on Freud's Verneinung. We just heard a little bit about Freud's essay and a little bit about Hyppolite's commentary. Now let's look at Lacan's response to Hyppolite's response to Freud. It starts on page 318. It's a terrific essay. And one of the great works in this essay is defining Bejahung. This term that is crucial, I think, to Lacan's philosophy of language and of communication, and also of his philosophy of the subject. His theory of the subject is very much hooked into this notion of Bejahung, which in German means affirmation, a confirmation of sorts. On page 319, Lacan gives us a definition toward the bottom of the page, about midway through, but heading towards the bottom of Bejahung. A mythical moment rather than a genetic moment. And what he means by that is that genetic means at the start, 1, 2, 3. That's not what Lacan is talking about here. When he says mythic, he means more like original, in the sense of origin versus genus. And this is important because the genetic move is to say that 1 begat 2 begat 3 begat 4, and so on. It's a very linear chronological approach to how things unfold in time. What Lacan is here doing when he uses the word mythical is he's talking about the way that a Bejahung or an affirmation is presupposed logically, not chronologically, but logically prior to an act of negation. Now that's not a question of genesis. That is a question of origin. An origin is something seen from a later moment. So you can right now look back at your childhood and say, those were the defining moments. And you could probably list them. It might be a parent's divorce. It could be an accident that you got into. It could be a great performance that you were a part of. You fill in the blanks. My point, though, is that you look back from the present onto a past that you then convert into your history by saying these were the defining moments. That is an original act. That's a look at your origins. Not where you started, but your origins. The parts of your past that contribute to mostly defining your present. That's what he's suggesting here with Bejahung. You need to have this retrospective approach, retroactive even. The key theme here is negation. But what Lacan wants to point out is that in order to negate something, you must first have affirmed its existence. So the example we were working with in the last lecture was, I'm not a liar. Well, in order for me to deny that I'm a liar, I'm not a liar, I'm not a liar, I'm not a liar, I have to presuppose a lot of agreements. Particularly the possibility that you might think I'm a liar, that I might feel I'm a liar deep down. Which is why I have to deny it, particularly in speech addressed to you in hopes that you'll believe me. There are lots of affirmations that go into any particular negation, is Lacan's point. In order for there to be a disagreement, a whole series of agreements have to occur beforehand. You could think about this, for instance, as having a disagreement with a friend or a roommate or a family member. There are implicit rules about how that agreement's going to unfold. There are certain things that are acceptable and unacceptable in a fight. So you might have a disagreement with a roommate, and you know that the rules of that disagreement exclude violence. You can't hit them. You can't throw stuff at them. You can't stab them, shoot them. All that stuff is off the table. Now, you don't have to sit down with them and have that discussion about the rules of the road before you engage in a disagreement with them. It's assumed that even though you might disagree on who did the dishes last, there's a whole field of agreements that are in place to make that disagreement ideally productive, but at the very least safe. So you're not going to get hurt. They're not going to beat you up over something like that. That is a Bejahung. There's a primitive affirmation, a primordial agreement that is implicit here in an act of negation or disagreement, right? This is kind of what we're getting at here. You can also think of the question that you might put to someone, do you understand me? That's a tricky question, because if you answer no, hasn't that also confirmed that you already understand them? You understand enough to say no. Similarly, even if somebody comes up to you and says, "안녕하세요," now you might not be Korean. If you are, you know exactly what I just asked. If you are not, however, you will nevertheless recognize that as a language that is being spoken to you. And your response might be, "I don't understand." Notice, you don't have any idea what was just said to you. You have no idea what I just asked. 안녕하세요? You don't know what that means. But you recognize it as a linguistic act addressed to you. You recognize it as language. You affirm it as a linguistic act. And you treat it accordingly by saying things like, "I don't understand." To respond, "I don't understand," to 안녕하세요 is to confirm that it's language, to say, "I recognize that you're addressing that to me, and because we're operating in the field of language, I can respond linguistically and maybe you'll understand." Even though you don't have any idea what I just said, and maybe if I'm Korean, I have no idea what you just said. Very doubtful, because most Koreans speak English, but very few American English speakers speak Korean. Bejahung is a mythical moment rather than a genetic moment, Lacan says on 319. One cannot even relate it to the constitution of the object, since it concerns the relationship between subject and being, not between the subject and the world. So this is a very primitive, start of everything mythical moment about the origins of language use. Repression is one of the central concepts of psychoanalysis. In order to repress something, you must first negate it. And in order to negate something, you must have first, at some basic level, affirmed it. And the term for that affirmation is Bejahung. That's why we're talking about this. You can see on 320, the next page, Lacan starts to hint a little further at this. At a discursive structuration on the basis of a primordial symbolization. That's Bejahung, that primordial symbolization. One of the key questions that comes up on 320 is also one of the great ways of understanding what he means by the real. What is excluded from the first moment of symbolization? He says on 320. Well, one of the things that oftentimes gets excluded from that, especially if you have the underlying clinical structure of psychosis, he says on 322, is castration. Now, castration here again doesn't mean some physical operation on the human anatomy. That's not what we're talking about. Castration in the Lacanian sense means prohibition, feelings of dependence, recognition that the world in which you live is not of your own making, and an acceptance of that. Castration is something that most humans accept. You accept that you are alienated in a world full of rules and terms and languages and laws and norms that are not of your own creation. And you just have to get on with it. The psychotic is somebody who fundamentally forecloses, utterly rejects that initial moment of castration. You can see it coming up at the bottom of page 322. Lacan says, quoting Freud, that some patient did not want to know anything about castration in the sense of repression. Now, what Lacan wants to make of this is saying they didn't want to know about it at the level of repression, which is a fundamentally neurotic or normal function, because they were experiencing it at the level of not repression, but Verwerfung, foreclosure, which is something different. You can see this at the bottom of page 322. Now, some of you have seen my lectures on Seminar 3 and psychosis. We're not going to get into that here. But do note that the topic of Bejahung comes up in Seminar 3, in the early 80s in particular. It's a great book, a great volume, not our focus here, but lots of work is done on this notion of Verwerfung. Verwarf sie. Lacan's going to make a lot of this verb, verwarf, which means to foreclose. Here he's using the word excise. Eventually it'll become foreclosure. He forecloses castration, bottom of 322. Again, the good source for this is Seminar 3, and you can see my lectures on that elsewhere. It's as though that didn't even exist. That didn't even occur. The castration and the prohibitions that most of us endure in order to become normal subjects with a coherent, relatively stable identity, the psychotic rejects, as though it never even happened, he suggests at the top of page 323. The theme of Verwerfung and Bejahung, foreclosure and negation and affirmation, continues on 323. They are opposed to each other. These are oppositional moments. Normally what happens is somebody affirms, accepts that they have to use words not of their own creation. They have to speak the mother's tongue in order to get their needs met. That's what I'm doing right now. The language you're hearing now is not one that was invented to coincide with my birth. It was there long before I showed up. And over time, my primary caregivers integrated me into that language and infused me with it so that now I speak it fluently, unconsciously, without even thinking about the words that come up. That's what it means to be fluent in a language. All of that presupposes that I accepted that original moment of prohibition. Remember, the prohibition we're talking about here is a prohibition against continuing life without prohibition. Infants don't know prohibition. When they need to go to the bathroom, they go to the bathroom. When they're upset, they cry. It's only with the advent of language in society that people start to learn, babies, infants, toddlers start to learn that there are certain places where it's inappropriate to go to the bathroom and others where it is. And so they learn to play by rules, in this case potty training, that are not of their own creation but imposed on them from without. And they accept that. They affirm and acknowledge that those rules exist and play by them. That primitive affirmation, that primitive acceptance of prohibition here is known as Bejahung. The psychotic subject, according to Lacan, is somebody who does not accept that, who acts as though there aren't any rules about when and where to go to the bathroom, for instance. That's what he's working on here on page 322 and 323. We'll come back to that in a minute with a close reading starting on 323.